Welcome to By-The-Bywater, a podcast on the Megaphonic Network. I'm Ned Raggett.
I'm Oriana Schwint.
I'm Jared Pekacek.
And we're here to talk about all things J.R.R. Tolkien, his work, his inspirations and impact, creative interpretations in other media, languages, lore, rip-offs, parodies, anything we think is interesting. Thanks for joining us. Hello and welcome to the 28th episode of By-The-Bywater here. We are glad to be back with you. It is the middle of the year. We will not dwell on the heat wave. It's there, let's just say. We're all on the West Coast and we're feeling it one way or another, even if indirectly. So let's just say it's hot. And with that out of the way, how is everybody? We've gotten through half this year. How the hell did that happen?
I have no idea.
I don't know. I must say, Jared is glistening in a very glamorous and beautiful way. So it's a shame that our listeners can't see.
Yeah, no. If we did what everyone seems to be doing the video versions of their podcast these days. No, never. We are not. Don't worry about that. We are just great to those who pull it off. But I'm just like no. That's like half the mom network podcast I listen to about RuPaul's Drag Race fandom and things like that. I'm like, why are you guys doing this? You don't have to. Trixie and Katya, I trust you're there as you are. You don't have to take some time off. Save it for Anyway, I could go on about that. I was sort of late myself because I was watching Drag Race España. This is another matter entirely. Tolkien would have words to say about this.
And you know what? We're glad he's not here to say them. It's fine. We're good. We're good with
arguably,
that.
the Valar, as we've hinted at before, gender is fluid, mutable. There you go. Maybe the Valar are nothing but a bunch of drag queens.
That
could
was
be an argument for
accidental enlightenment on his part.
Yeah.
All right, so believe it or not, we should get into this because believe it or not, there's actual news. My God, there's a ton of it. So this has been an actually busy past month. There is a lot to talk about, and then we have my choice of subject, which I think we all agreed was even more going on with that than I realized when I picked it. It's been a while. We will get to that. It is, however, time for the news, and as always, we'll all have things to say this time. But as always, Jared, please start us off.
Yeah, it's a bit of a shock. We have some actual non-Amazon Tolkien news this time around, even though it's about, still about an adaptation. Warner Brothers announced a wholly new animated film called The War of the Rohirrim, which draws on the history of Rohan in the appendices to The Lord of the Rings, specifically the story of Helm Hammerhand. This is the same figure after whom Helm's Deep was renamed, I guess, who fought in a notably messy civil war that broke out at the same time as, wider machinations by Sauron against Gondor, as well as a horribly destructive winter season. So there's material to draw on, at least. Yeah. What's particularly notable about this adaptation is not merely a return to Tolkien via animation, but specifically anime, with director Kenji Kamiyama, who's notable for his work on shows like Ghost in the Shell, Standalone Complex, Morabito, Napping Princess, Ultraman, and the forthcoming Blade Runner Black Lotus, which is another Warner Brothers effort. And Philippa Boyens from the Peter Jackson creative team will be a consultant, and the current plan is a theatrical release in around 3 years' time.
That's really remarkable. We're getting an actual film, an anime in the theater film. This is really something.
Really unexpected. Where did this come from? And who do I talk to have a similar thing done for like some material from the Silmarillion? I don't. It's just not how did this even get into the ether? Like what rights needed to be? I'm so confused.
Hold the thought about rights. Here's what I can say. There's more I can't. This is not necessarily a secret, so in terms of involvement, but Jason DeMarco, who is I can never remember if he's the top guy at Adult Swim or just one of the top creative guys at Adult Swim, basically is involved, and he said as much on his Twitter, and he and I have been following each other on Twitter for a while. I did talk to him briefly, quietly. There's a lot that I cannot say, and there's a lot I didn't ask him. But suffice to say that this is something that they are very serious about this. It was one of those things that sort of the right people talk to the right people. certainly a pretty inspired idea to go this direction, as more than one person remarked. And of course, as we talked about in our April episode on the 1977 Rankin Bass Hobbit, this is hardly the first time there have been Japanese animators working on Tolkien. So it's almost like a return to that approach, different with a different generation. But notably, instead of it being the case where it's an American creative team directing Japanese animators saying, please do this time around, the center of it is going to be an actual Japanese animator and director, and one with a heck of a resume. We mentioned Jared mentioned some of the work he's done. He's also, Studio Ghibli veteran, many more things besides. This person has chops, serious chops, and a very serious rep too. And there is a lot to delve into in terms of rights and things about that. But for the moment, I just think it's a really inspired idea.
Yeah.
I mean, why not? Yeah, this is a good choice. There is material in the appendices about this. There is arguably enough material. But as Oriana, as you pointed out, we get into the interesting area that it's pointed out rather in our private Slack discussions. We get in an interesting area we've hinted at before and mentioned in previous episodes that the Rohirrim story, displacing a bunch of people who were there. This is kind of the big eruption of that into Middle Earth history. And there's something weirdly fascinating about it. How will that be handled? That's a very good question. I don't know.
At all? Are we obviously only time will tell, but I would really enjoy if they addressed that.
Mm-hmm. I'm betting it'll be the same kind of thing they did in the Jackson movies, where there's just the one shot of Saruman being like, they stole your lands, they stole your homes, but they're all dirty barbarians and not that great.
I don't know. I mean, there's enough going on in the appendices, in that specific conversation between, I can never remember the character's name, the one that Helm actually kills with a blow that starts essentially the revolt. They obviously bring up the fact that this person, he's part of the Rohirrim and part Dunlandish. And again, that's one of those things like, how are you going to handle that? I think it's one of those things. Questions of nuance are going to be interesting. I don't think they're just going to simply hand wave it because it's almost a little too central to the story. But how they handle it, we're going to find out. We're going to find out. Yeah, something else to look forward to on Deadline stuff. But speaking of deadlines, Oriana, how about the news about that Amazon series?
Yeah, there's some news there. Although, Ned, I'm not quite as enthused by, or quite as, oh my god, news, because...
Right, yeah. This is more like,
It comes from contracts. So Amazon is not the source of this news. There's a report that's gone around, and if it's accurate, we do have a slightly better idea as to why there hasn't really been that much news from Amazon itself, as well as a sense of when we'll actually be able to watch this series. So, as reported by the Fellowship of Fans Twitter account, they provided scans of the relevant paperwork. So there's a formal contract that's been drawn up and apparently signed off on by both Amazon and the New Zealand government, who, have an understandable interest in all of this hullabaloo on the economic and tourism front. So there's a number of details that we're expecting here. So there was language in there about trailers, making of documentaries, behind the scenes things, this is where my all right, okay.
Yeah.
But the kicker is we have some apparent timelines. So while prep work and filming itself is continuing, the first big marketing push, presumably including initial images and a teaser trailer, is due this November. So still a bit of a ways away, but November, and then things will ramp up after that, with Amazon apparently aiming to have the first season airing so that it finishes by or in fall of 2022, and this may change yet again. But right now it's looking like fall 2022, which feels very far away right now.
Feels far away, but it makes a lot more sense than the, continual idea that would be ready by the end of the year, which I was so not buying. Yeah, no, this makes a little more sense. It's almost an interesting holiday run-up is the best way to put it, even though there might not be much to actually show.
Yeah.
Although, we'll yet see about that. So that's interesting there. Now, here's something that I was wondering about, and there is an article in the onering.net that actually delved into this a little more. Now, it's speculation in terms of rights, but we'll link it in the show notes. But the argument was essentially looking at the contracts here and looking at what's been said and going, okay, hold on, wait a minute. Let's take a long view here. Warner Brothers, which again is the one behind this new anime thing, is their rights thing comes on the agreement with Middle Earth Enterprises, the old Saul Zaentz, the project that, of course, now still has and maintains and obviously is not giving up on the rights to specifically The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. Although there is the weird little wrinkle, which I still think is a little overblown, of the fact that Amazon now has the interest in MGM, who hold like half the Hobbit rights, but that's its own tangle.
Yeah.
And I'm not going to, dwell on that too much because, frankly, that's even just too weird to contemplate. But then, of course, you've got the separate Amazon deal that we all know about, and that was done by the estate directly with Amazon. And basically the idea is drawing on, theoretically, everything else, which is fantastic. But at the same time, the announcement of the anime, of the Helmhammer anime, seems to muddy the waters a bit. Now, on the one hand, it is drawing from the appendices, because that's that material that's in Lord of the Rings. Theoretically, it's covered by that. At the same time, at what point do the appendices and everything else that's drawn on, where do you draw the line? And that makes it all the more interesting is the fact, too, that in the initial logo, not the main logo for the announcing the War of the Rohirrim, but the little sub-logo they had above it was the, dare I say now, classic Lord of the Rings film logo. It was one of those things. And the part of this announcement is that it's supposed to be all formally tied in with the Jackson adaptations. In other words, it's part of that world. So I bring all this up because the OneRing.net article, again, boiling down what they're going into, says that from what they can tell, and this is, again, their argument, so we're not claiming this is the argument, but from what they can tell and from the people they've spoken to, on background, as they say, is that what's essentially happened is a bit of a weird truce, which boils down to this. So the anime is meant to be released theatrically. That's important. Apparently the idea is Warner Brothers can make films, Amazon can make TV stuff. This is the argument, and it might seem like a fine line, but frankly, there have been stupider fine lines in terms of dividing up rights in Hollywood. So I'm not necessarily surprised by this argument. Maybe it's one of those things that, again, since the ultimate problem, as you can all tell here, is that there is no one-to-one, hi, we are the estate, hi, we are the filmmakers, we have made a deal, boom.
Yeah.
It's too messy and layered at this point. And again, those people who have those rights, again, specifically, the Saul Zaentz derived crew, aren't letting those go. So clearly, it's just going to be like this for a while. So that may be how we get around things, but it also draws into interesting questions about maybe another division is, does Amazon get the second age? Does Warner Brothers get the third?
It feels, because I thought the Amazon deal was for the appendices material.
It was for everything that wasn't Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit, was my understanding. So pretty much everything like Unfinished Tale, Silmarillion, theoretically.
Oh, really?
And anything else. Yeah, that was my understanding of it. Maybe we need to go back and look at the terms of the deal. Right. But the idea was that since Hobbit and Lord of the Rings had already been sort of split off, the idea is, well, here's everything else. Now, there may be something else going on that we missed in terms of the subtleties of this, but this is where the opacity of the estate and its dealings is also an issue. Without anything in front of us to know exactly what the hell is going on, everyone's kind of groping in the dark here. The OneRing.net's take on it is as good as anything, and even that's kind of speculative. So
it is funny that it is so opaque. It's like, why? It's just, it doesn't change anything to have the terms kind of laid out so that people can understand what to expect.
I've probably said this before, but I love that the estate is like this. I find it really, and I mean, it kind of sucks for like podcast purposes because you can't talk about what they're thinking, but it's very funny to me as a person that you never know what the Tolkien estate is actually thinking.
You have no idea what's out there, what's in play, what isn't in play exactly. I think for me, it's just personally frustrating, not even on like a personal level, just as a writer level, because I feel like I've said this before, but all I want is for someone to give me money to adapt the Silmarillion in some way. That's all I want. I moved my dumb ass all the way to Los Angeles in pursuit of this goal. Help me, someone.
And hey, if they've opened the door to anime, that means we can open the door to other versions of this.
Right?
It can be done. Special effects are not a limitation here, so let's keep that in mind. There is one other thing briefly to bring up, just a small note about the man himself and his work, and that is this. A while back we mentioned that there is an actual forthcoming new Tolkien book, namely The Nature of Middle-earth, which is drawing on last tranche of various background writings and essays from near the end of his life, more or less, on a variety of subjects, notably including more about Numenor, but not just limited to that. It was initially due for release, this past month. It was postponed a little while back, and it will be coming out a couple of months in early September, probably as an early holiday release. More on that once we all see it. So if you had been filing that away, it's, they had changed the pre-order dates. I was one of those things going like, shouldn't it be announced by now? And I checked, and they had bumped it ahead a bit. So just one of those things. But still en route, still coming here. Hopefully we'll see it soon. I am very excited about that. It is kind of good we're actually getting that first before all these other things. And they're sort of like, yeah. Why don't we get to the source here and get a little more. And I do think it'll be, I wonder, especially with the, I don't want to say the delays. I mean, the world was delayed. But with the fact that the Amazon series taking this long, it's almost sort of like, there could also be a further impetus to sort of like get Tolkien's thoughts about Numenor fully out there before the series comes. I don't know. We'll learn, won't we? So that's the news. We actually have some news, and it'll probably go back to another few months of nothing before, Amazon finally does do something here. So if that contract's right, we'll talk to you in 4 months. So until then, we'll have the book coming out before then, though. So at least we have that. Okay, so with that said, there is a lot to talk about in my subject. As I said, I almost didn't realize how heavy this would be when I picked it, even though I knew it was heavy, but oh my gosh, there's a lot to dig into. So let's go ahead with the main topic, and it is my choice. To say that the Children of Húrin holds a key place in Tolkien's creative work is both an understatement and, in a sense, anachronistic. Tolkien never completed a book of this exact title, nor saw it published. And as Christopher Tolkien explains in the appendices to the book as released in 2007, what we know of as the Children of Húrin is a carefully constructed version that draws on a number of unpublished drafts and variations on the story over time, including an extensive poetic version from the 1920s that remains one of Tolkien's longest exercises in alliterative verse. The most developed version Tolkien partially completed was written in the early 1950s and showcased in the Unfinished Tales collection, along with accompanying notes and details on incomplete draft sections. Much like the published Silmarillion, where a summarized version of the story told in the Children of Húrin was first available to Tolkien's readers, to read the book is to read something syncretic, an approximation rather than a finally, definitively told form. But it is key nonetheless, in a true historical sense. Even more so than much of his mythology's other foundational work starting in the late 1910s, it arguably haunts everything that followed in a way that throws much of that other work into sharp relief. Christopher Tolkien, drawing on his father's terminology, identified it as one of the three great tales of Middle-earth, foundational stories of elves and men having come into contact, key houses or clans of the latter assisting the former in their existential struggle against Morgoth. Of the other two, Beren and Luthien is the story of tragic triumph, a deed so famous it arguably changed not only the course of the war against Morgoth, but reshaped the literal fates of the children of Ilúvatar. The Fall of Gondolin, however extensive the lead-up, is at base a quick story of the destruction of a rich haven in a single evening's terror, though one with the last promise and hope of Middle-earth still emerging that would finally bring about the end of Morgoth's reign and power. But the Children of Húrin, the final name of a story given many titles over time, is something else entirely. It is mostly the story of the oldest of three children, Túrin, the heir apparent to a fiefdom ruled by Húrin, leader of the House of Hador, who serve a branch of the Noldor in northern Beleriand, not far distant from Morgoth's realm to the further north. Described as a serious child who grows even more so following the death of his younger sister after a plague, Túrin is forced to flee as a child refugee after an apocalyptic battle, the Nirnaeth Arnoedad, and I hope I pronounced that right, which results in the destruction of the northern Noldoran kingdoms and the near-total death of all the warriors, elves and men, who fought in it. Húrin himself is one of the few survivors, captured and tormented by Morgoth, who curses him and his family. Made to leave by his mother Morwen, herself still pregnant with what would be Húrin's final child and Túrin's surviving sister Nienor, Túrin is led to the forest realm of Doriath, whose ruler Thingol, now forever changed following the deeds of Beren and his daughter Luthien, adopts Túrin as a foster child and raises him to be among his many warriors and followers. However, ever cognizant of his status and bitter and sad about his separation from his family and homeland, Túrin gets caught up in a conflict with a counselor of Thingol that turns deadly, and he chooses exile over eventual forgiveness. From there, Túrin's story is one that can best be described as incremental and temporary triumphs that eventually lead to horrific disasters, to the point where Túrin's life story could almost be easily parodied. We'll link in the show notes to a Tumblr post that almost sums it up all too well as a first-person account of a goth incel with attitude. Yet in ways, that's because Tolkien isn't describing a world where real triumphs are known, especially among men, relatively newly come to Beleriand and only just learning over a couple of generations about wars, rivalries, and world-encompassing, world-predating even, struggles. There's no hobbit kindness of spirit or gentle celebrations of the everyday to be found here. Instead, there's survival under an increasingly grimmer shadow. As Morgoth's forces roam more freely throughout Beleriand, shelters are hard-won and not easy to maintain, and both chance and intent still ultimately lead to brutality and death no matter the best intent. It is ultimately a story of survival against odds, and the odds grow blacker for nearly everyone involved. And even the survivors themselves aren't aware of how quickly things will turn grim for them in the years following the story's conclusion. This isn't really what a lot of people read Tolkien for. Most people understand him through the lens of happy endings of a sort, or at least eucatastrophe, that sudden reversal of fortune from grim to exultant that he coined as a term. But this is not comfort reading, though arguably it is cathartic. Tolkien here drew on many sources: the grinding destruction of his own experience in war, the finished story of the flawed antihero Kullervo, one of his earliest works of translation, the grim progression of so many of the Icelandic sagas, the brutal theatricality of Greek tragedy, and more besides, to posit a world where instead of happy memories, someone fights against fates without knowing what ultimately he is facing or how, and whose story, and that of his sister Nienor, ends in a series of terrible revelations. It's also perhaps the most overtly sexual and physical of Tolkien's story, though almost in all senses one driven by failures and rage, from the disrobing and tormenting of an opponent of Túrin to the threat of rape, the one seemingly successful heterosexual romantic relationship itself built on sand and utterly destroyed in the end. But that is perhaps why the Children of Húrin, when it was released in this standalone form 3 decades after Christopher Tolkien first shared it via the Silmarillion, has now taken on such resonance, especially for a younger fan base for whom it has always been there. It's always been published. It's an implicit rebuke to the post-George R.R. Martin grimdark fantasy world that claims Tolkien was somehow too light or prim to attempt such a story, especially since this story was part of the legendarium from the start. Meanwhile, for those who claim that Tolkien is not the realm of nuance, detail, or the qualities that supposedly only literary fiction, quote-unquote, can provide, then this story upsets those assumptions at many points, in its sense of driven energy, brooding mental heaviness, the physical and mental scars of trauma, and finally ultimate last actions as much a story of violent existentialism as many landmarks of post-World War II writing. All the more striking, because Tolkien himself had no interest or connection to that world at all. Like the later story Eldarion and Arendis, similarly the work of an older writer less prone or easy to simple conclusions, The Children of Húrin ranks as one of the most truly mature works of Tolkien's life, not simply because it is quote-unquote dark, but because so much of it is so recognizably, almost painfully, human. More could be said, but it's time to open up the floor. Where do you want to begin with this?
Where do you want to begin, Ned? There's
Well,
there's so many roads into this. Like
there really are. I mean, I reading through it, we were talking about this before we started recording, but I read it when the book first came out. I was, just say I was all over it, and I remember vividly reading it. It was a bright summer day I was visiting my folks in Carmel and sitting out in their sunroom. You couldn't ask for a more delightful setting. Boy, that thing just dug deep and just sort of like, that you can be the most comfortably seated. Perfect. I'm going to read this book. And by the end of it, you'll just be like, because it's so, I mean, and that's the thing too. I mean, getting back to it, this is, it's transformed obviously, but here was a very young man who admittedly had already seen the horrors of war, you could say, and there is a connection there. And he had already gotten familiar with again the Kalervo story. He was very well familiar with. He had already started his and Oriana's holding up her copy of the Kalevala there. It is from the Kalevala, the Finnish collection of folk tales and mythology. To take that and create an initial version of it is one thing, and he did his wrote a story as part of the Book of Lost Tales. But by the time of this more or less final version, and again, Christopher Tolkien is clear enough that while there are sections that essentially had to be a little more stitched together, much of it was very clearly written, notably the beginning and the end. For once, this was not an abandoned tale like halfway through. He actually did thoroughly write out what he wanted the ending to be. It really delves deep. It really is almost something like, especially post Lord of the Rings. He had written his big tale of triumph, and then he had gone back and revisited this thing, and it's almost the complete opposite of that. It is something that is so, gosh, I mean, I think maybe here's a starting point. I'm trying to think here, is that Tolkien is very careful throughout. That on the one hand, while the idea is that Morgoth has cursed Húrin and cursed his family and cursed his children, and you could argue this is the curse working out, is a supernatural force that is basically doing everything. At the same time, the story gives plenty of options, and more than once is very clear about the fact that it isn't a supernatural curse. It is differing wills working out and people making all the wrong decisions for what seem at the time to be the possibly right reasons. And that, I think, is what makes it really resonant. It's not a predetermined story. It's not like this is how you're doomed. It's more like, you chose this path, you made your decision, and it goes from there. And there are so many examples of it throughout. That's the terrible thing. Mm-hmm. It's like it's an endless
few
list.
Pages, he's doing something that you're like, no, please don't. And not just him.
His mom.
His mom, Beleg, like every single person he comes in contact with, the two surviving siblings come into contact with, like it does have the feel of a curse because they seem to poison the minds of everyone who, like, in a way where they're really trying to do their best with these wayward folk and just can't contain them, just can't contain the destruction that emanates from them.
Which is such an interesting pattern, I think, because at almost every point in the story, some member of this family is going, I'm going to do this thing that's objectively kind of dumb. Mm-hmm. And everybody around them is like, no honey.
Please don't.
You should not do it for these reasons. And Túrin or Morwen or whoever is like, I'm going to do it anyway. And the people are like, well, we love you, so we're not going to force you not to do it.
And in fact, we're going to help you in some of the cases.
Yeah. And then it just goes wrong. And it starts by the end, along with the fact that he keeps changing his name, it starts piling up to be almost like a dark comedy where it's like, we're doing this again. Mm-hmm. not in an tiresome way, but like, oh my God, have you not learned?
Yeah, by the time you get to the appearance of Glaurung the dragon and the fall of Nargothrond, you've already seen Túrin make the absolute worst choices every single time. And he still goes after the granddaddy of all dragons, quite literally. And go, no, man, I can handle this. Mm-hmm. And he certainly does not. He's supposed to save Finduilas. One of the residents of Nargothrond. Is she? She's Jesus, saying these names out loud for the first time is impossible. Anyway, she's Orodreth's daughter, who is of the House of Finarfin, and he's foretold to have to save her or else, his fate is sealed. He's like, well, I'm certainly not going to let that happen. And then we cut to like 10 minutes later. Yeah. Oh gosh.
Mm-hmm. I mean, the dark comedy is right. And again, you can, it's one of those things that, this is why I kind of said, it's hard to if you're so used to, as we are, Hobbit, Lord of the Rings, this is how people know Middle Earth. 90%. This is how it happens. We don't see a story like this. This is not something that is known to us now. Increasingly, it is because, well, it's there. It hasn't been adapted yet. Maybe it'll never be, and that could be a further factor in how it's done. But I mean. Yeah, I brought up the George R. R. Martin comparison for a reason, not merely because there's incest. Hello,
But also,
because it is so grim. And Tolkien knew his grim stories. I mean, these Icelandic sagas there for a reason. This is It's very interesting how Tolkien does do something that the sagas don't always do, which is step inside the mind of the characters, their internal monologue. That's something that famously is something that Icelandic sagas essentially do not do. Everything is externally described action. You have to figure out motivation from the inside. Here he's allowing for more of that nuance, which is again an interesting thing. It shows that Tolkien is a more modern author. He's not simply trying to recreate something. But yeah, I mean it's hard to, and it may be the case maybe for Americans in particular. I don't know, or at least a certain amount of them. But it's hard to let yourself go into. It's like, okay, this is going to be a pessimistic story. All your hopes are going to be crushed.
Mm-hmm.
He is like very much an anti-hero in the truest sense. He isn't a hero. Even like he literally becomes an outlaw and kills men, like kills other men. We don't really see that too often.
The thing that Tolkien does that I think is interesting is he does try to establish, child is father of the man. What was Túrin like as a kid? This is something we don't often get in Tolkien. We don't often get this. We get the story of adults for the large part. We don't often get the story of kids from birth to death. Túrin is not totally unique in this regard, but he's almost near unique, especially for such a notable figure. We do get a sense of what he was like as young. I mean, if you want to play up the dark comedy, the bit about him and saying he didn't want so much to play with his other sister, Lailoth, but he just liked to watch her from a distance. I'm like, yeah, that's not creepy, but
From an early age, there was something wrong with him.
But at the same time, it's one of those things that is sort of, you get a sense of, and this also ties in the fact that I think you do get a sense, especially of what his parents were like and how someone can be a fusion of the two. He's very much Morwen's child in the sense of sort of like, hi, I have dark hair and I'm going to be very brooding, clearly, because Morwen is nothing but brooding. And all
She's
that.
so goth. Everybody's very goth in this story, but she's.
But Húrin is not. Húrin is the light of the party. You can tell,
He's
and all
Thor,
that.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think it's important that, we have this sense of those first few years where, obviously things are not perfect because, both his grandfather and his father were killed after, Morgoth broke things through with the dagger of Bragaloch and everyone's put on edge. But again, the deeds of Beren and Luthien have now sort of re-inspired everybody and everyone's feeling like, okay, maybe we got something going here. And Dorloman was not on the front lines. It's something that can sort of like, you can still have a somewhat normal life and he's the heir to the throne. He's not just any guy, He's actually somebody who's up there, and seeing that dynamic of how Húrin and Morwen, work in peacetime, even though there's only a small bit of it, we get it. And I think that is important. You get a sense of what a normal life might have been like. You get a hint of what it might have been like. And it first starts to turn when Lailoth, the middle sister, does die in the plague, and everyone starts to get a little more grim. And these details about how Túrin reacts, how Húrin reacts, how Morwen icily locks down. It's almost like she wants to deny it ever happened. It's something that she, it's a very interesting. And again, this is one of these details that I really like about the story. How do people deal with heartrending grief? In one case, Húrin is very, sort of outspoken about it. He tries to mourn openly. He can't. He destroys his harp. He curses wildly. Morwen pretty much is just like, and almost says nothing except in the total control of things like this. And Túrin almost doesn't know what to do. And he's a kid. And what can he do? And, and these nuances are really... I credit Tolkien as a writer. I mean, this is something that is hard to do for any writer. I think in this fantastic landscape with these supernatural things in a world that didn't exist, he pulled off a portrait incredibly well of what happens when fate puts this on you. And this is before the curse.
In the midst of talking about the nuance, though, I do have to mention that the daughter who dies, well, life means laughter.
Yeah.
So laughter dies.
Literally.
we're not being subtle all the time here.
Well, I mean, I brought up the fact that it's not a hobbity tale for a reason. All the hobbity type characters pretty much do die miserably pretty quickly. I mean, there's Lailoth, there's his aunt Rian, the one who's married to Huor, mother of Tuor. She just basically just wants to sing in the woods and just talk about the gentle things. Fate's got another story for you, and she ends up walking towards the mound of dead and just dying there.
Yeah, isn't the narrative even the narration even points out like she would have been awesome.
Yeah.
In another time, she was not made to handle this. Sucks to be her, and that's like her entire, that's like her paragraph that she gets when she's dead.
Well, it's not Huor's story and Tuor's story to be fair, but you're right, of course.
Oh, yeah. Well, we've talked about why it's not their story in the past, and how my feelings on Tuor have been made abundantly clear.
We won't talk about it later. Go back to episode 2; it's in there somewhere. He's still just a guy. But I mean, I don't want to be this mostly me just going da about the story. So like what like there's lots of little moments that stand out for me, and I don't want to just simply name them all off because I kind of want to hear what are some of the things that sort of strike you most about whether it's characterization, setting, description. Is there anything in particular that sort of like really strikes you? Because there are a couple of things in the story I think are uniquely Tolkien. And I don't just simply mean in terms of setting. It's more sort of like only he would have phrased it quite this way or did this quite this way. I can't think of anyone else who would have done it this way. So, but I'll get back to that. What are kind of some of your thoughts?
I'm trying to think of things that strike me as uniquely Tolkien about this, and I feel like part of that is the way he handles the dragon. I don't know that he was the first to do this kind of thing, but he was definitely one of the more prominent ones, doing dragons as this sort of like not just intelligent but vicious and mocking. And one of the things that makes Glaurung so horrifying to me is that he's not just evil. He's not just like, oh, I'm going to ravage the countryside and stack up the gold and eat the people. That's what dragons do. But he's just petty. He ruins these people's lives because he can. And Smaug is a little bit like that, but he's also in a children's story. When I've reread the Silmarillion, most of the time I skip the Túrin story because I find the pettiness of Glaurung so upsetting. Everything else is upsetting too, but I don't know. It just hits me in this weird way where he's just like, he just ruins their lives. And then when he's dying, after Túrin finally kills him, his last act is to be like, hey, all along,
here's the truth.
You were married to your sister. And Túrin's like, I'm going to kill myself now. And he just does it because he wants to. It's vengeance, but it's also like, he didn't have to do any of this. He could have just eaten Túrin. But he just wanted to mess with people.
Ditto with when Nienor and Morwen happen upon the ruin of Nargothrond and Glaurung. He could have killed them, eaten them. He was right there. And instead, no, he does he sets in motion the whole portion where Nienor flees witless into the woods, memory totally wiped, naked as a babe. She literally doesn't remember how to speak and has to be retaught how to speak by the woodland community that she stumbles upon, that Túrin happens to have been a member of, or the leader of at that point, I guess. It is funny. I brought this up in the Slack. This has nothing to do with your prompt, Ned. I'm sorry, but
go right ahead.
I don't think this was intentional, but Glaurung as metaphor for depression hit me much stronger this reading. I don't know if I just kind of didn't read it as carefully the first time, or just kind of wasn't in the state of mind to make that connection the first time I read this, but this time I was like, whoa, this is very obvious. Like, he literally clouds the mind, dispels perception and makes you, he lies. He makes you think these horrifying catastrophes have happened that haven't actually. Pretty solid depression metaphor. Thanks. Thanks, Ronald.
There's also, if we're on Glaurung for now, I feel like he also works as a kind of a dark version of Túrin in a way, because Túrin's whole thing as he goes through life is, first of all, being extremely hot. So everybody is like, I will listen to this man. But he is constantly getting people to do things.
Yeah.
he sways them into doing things. Like, he brings about the ruin of Nargothrond by convincing them to break their secrecy, to build this unbreakable bridge over the river, which is how Glaurung gets to the city in the first place. He's always convincing people to do things against their, not necessarily better judgment, but he's able to reason them into these things that just curse them. And Glaurung, he doesn't convince people, he just directly ensorcels them. But it's still like, you're not so different, you and I kind of vibe at the end there.
Truly, though. I hadn't thought about that. You're exactly right. He does have this way of making people, not, actual, that's an actual, like, phrasing that I can't look up because it's a library book and I didn't mark it. But the narration actually says that he is able to persuade, if not, he never, like, physically forces anyone to do things for him, but people find themselves sort of commanded by him nonetheless.
So I think something that goes into this, question of where does his charisma come from is that he is very consciously,
he's hot.
set up this.
He's hot.
He's hot. That helps. and something, and I'll get back to a particular point about that. Something you brought up before, Oriana, in another context. But the thing I want to bring up is that he's kind of aware early on that sort of like, you're the heir, you're the one, you're the thing there. So, and when he is forced to leave and goes to Doriath and he learns much and all the rest of it, he clearly always has that in his brain. He knows he is destined for greater things. And at the same time, he also knows he's in a world where that's not happening. Where it's not happening rather violently. And you could argue every time he's trying to recreate that one way or another. And that impulse is arguably very destructive because it is utterly reckless. It is something that he's sort of, I'm not saying his goal is something like, I need a kingdom, but his thing that Tolkien brings up is a sense that there is, and this plays out in very interesting ways too, and one or two particular ways I want to get to in a sec, is that the sense of justice, the sense that he is, there's something, I don't want to say Robin Hoodish about him, that's not really true, but there is something of the idea that, he hates injustice. And there's always something interesting about stories where someone who thinks that, something is wrong and I will fix it, how you fix it may not be exactly what needs to happen. We see this in Lord of the Rings, we talked about, I think just the other episode, Sam de Galadriel. If you had the ring, you do things right. That where you start, but that would not be where it ended. That sort of thing happens here too. Túrin doesn't sense how things will end whenever he creates his new miniature kingdoms, for lack of a better term, whether he creates them or he takes them over or becomes the focal point. Every one of them goes down in ruins, with the exception maybe of the last one, but that's a kind of special case because instead of it going down in ruins, he goes down. So, it's sort of like it's one or the other. So there's a lot there. Now, something I want to get into, though, before it completely escapes me, and I mentioned this again, what's something Oriana bring up, we have an interesting case here of, we have, what is the classic Tolkien motif? Dudes who marry up.
Yeah.
We have a case here where that doesn't happen badly several times over. It is the dark mirror of Beren and Luthien. Instead of the ultimate moment, we get something where not one but two elf women come into his life, because we have Fandwilas, which seems like it'll be the parallel, but then everything goes awfully wrong. But before that, there is the character of Nellis, who is the elf maid who keeps an eye on him and seems to hold a torch for him, but it never really is entirely laid out what's going on there. So that's kind of interesting.
She recognizes that he belongs to Beleg. That's
100%.
Let's talk about that too, because that is the most interesting relationship in the thing, is Túrin and Beleg.
Túrin is also supposedly the tallest of the children of men. So the question becomes: is he hot or is he tall? Is he just tall? I'm just saying. Anyway, but
I'm pretty sure the book says he has a nice face.
It does, but those tall boys, they fool you. I'm just saying.
Because their head is so distant.
Yeah, it's a Monet.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, but yes, we need to discuss the Beleg of it all.
We absolutely do. Jared, you want to lead off on this one? Go right ahead.
They're obviously in love, or at least Beleg is. Yeah, so Beleg is he's like, what is he, the head of the King's Rangers or something like that?
Security forces.
Yeah, he's in charge of something, and he's an archer.
Yeah, well, he's like the border guy, and Mablung is the hand of the hunters. Those are like the two chief guys.
Okay.
Yeah,
Unsure what the difference is exactly between those, but
one hunts things in the forest, the other hunts orcs on the borders.
Right,
I don't know.
fair enough.
Yeah, and when Túrin first comes to Doriath as like a boy, and this is like, we can gloss over the implications of this if we want to. Beleg is the one who, like, his tutor. And then Túrin grows up, and the book says something like it's very David and Jonathan, sort of like, there never was any such love as that between Beleg and Túrin. I'm probably misquoting, but it's along those lines. And then when Túrin leaves Doriath, Beleg is the one who goes after him and is like, I gotta do this. And Melian's like, okay, I bless your gay love with this lembus. And
not a verbatim quote there, Jared.
No, that part's not verbatim.
Heavy subtext, though.
Heavy subtext. And then, Beleg follows him into the wilderness out of sheer devotion, and then ends up getting killed by Túrin.
And that moment is seen to be way more tragic than almost any other moment in the story, except for arguably the end. Yeah.
He's trying to... No, what are the circumstances?
Beleg chases the orcs who have captured Túrin to the very edge of Dorthonion. Like, they're on the verge of Anfoglith and heading towards Thangorodrim. He's able to sneak him away. He and Gwyndor, the elf escapee from Thangorodrim they found, are able to grab him, go down there, and they're gonna cut him loose. Yeah. But like Beleg's like hand slips or something, and he accidentally hits Túrin with a sword. Subtext. And
just a little prick. Just a little prick.
Oh God, where are we going? And Túrin then suddenly wakes up, basically sees this horrible shape over him, thinks, God, wait, I'm free, and that's it for Beleg. And then he realizes what he's done, and he's literally struck dumb, voiceless for like months.
And the sword grieves for him as well.
Yes,
the sword that is now Túrin's. Edges are blunt.
It's funny because that sword is one of the few things that is like a direct borrowing from the Kullervo story from the Kalevala. And although the sword in that story only talks at like the exact end, which is kind of funny. It's like, oh, and there's a sword that talks now, which is very Kalevala.
But that's the case with this one too. I mean,
all of a sudden.
Well, it's been a long time since I've read the Kalevala, but I know in this case the sword is ambiguously sentient the whole time, because it does go blunt when Beleg dies. It grieves for him. Yeah. And when Melian gives the sword to Beleg, she's like, this sword is,
it's got some bad
kind of
vibes.
Malicious.
Yeah.
You might not want to. And he's like, no, I gotta. So whatever. So it doesn't talk the whole time, but it definitely is processing things.
Yeah, it has an agenda of its own almost, because it was forged by this curmudgeonly meanie who gave it very unwillingly.
And getting back to questions about Túrin and Beleg's clear relationship, I think it's incredibly telling that when Beleg arrives and hangs out with Túrin on Amon Rúd, if that's how you pronounce her, Amon Ruth, is that Mim, the father of the Petty-dwarves, who has been Túrin's chief confidant, gets incredibly jealous almost immediately. It's sort of like dynamics. So there's a lot to unpack. I think the story about him among the outlaws, as they say, because that gets into some serious business. I mentioned it. It is the only story I can think of where Tolkien explicitly discusses essentially an attempted rape. Yeah, in pretty visceral terms, almost is what it is. I mean, that's something that's I think it's kind of remarkable, the literal rough humor that he puts in. It reminds me of what Tolkien talked about in one of his letters or his descriptions of what life in the trenches was like about in World War I, about how everything was like orc talk or things like that. Yeah. So it seems to be that sort of rough thing here. In fact, let me see if I can find. So reading a bit here. When spring was come was perilous for the Gwarwaith, the band, essentially, he is one of the leaders in, to linger so near the houses of the woodmen who might gather and hunt them down. And Túrin wondered, therefore, that Forwig did not lead them away. There was more food and game and less peril away south where no men remained. Then one day Túrin missed Forwig and also Androg his friend, and he asked where they were, but his companions laughed. Away on business of their own, I guess, said Olred. They will be back before long, then we shall move. In haste, maybe, for maybe we shall be lucky if they do not bring the hive bees after them. I mean, that's just, and as we find out, that's incredibly, dehumanizing and misogynistic all at once, because they're basically going out to capture a woman to attack her, assault her. And Túrin prevents this rather violently, and kills one of them, kills Forwig, and then leaving Androg alive. And then, interestingly, and this I think also ties into some of, I dare I say, Tolkien's issues, one can say, perceptions, is that to say, like, basically is sort of like, Túrin says to, it says to its survivor, Androg, you will leave the woman to me or you will join Forwig. Androg laughed. Is that as the way of it? Have your will. I make no claims to match you. Alone, but our fellows may take the slaying ill. Then the woman rose to her feet and laid her hand on Túrin's arm. She looked at the blood and she looked at Túrin, and there was delight in her eyes. Kill him, Lord, she said. Kill him too, and then come with me. If you bring their heads, Lanark, my father, will not be displeased. For 2 wolf heads, he has rewarded men well. And Túrin's like, no. And this is it's his weird sort of, I don't want to say purism, but you also, because the other subtext around here, it's one of those things that, he clearly is not liking this. He clearly is not liking where this is going, and cuts it off almost immediately. And it's sort of like, is this Túrin as someone unsure about what to do? Is this Túrin uncomfortable things? Is this Túrin being incredibly excessively purist, like, oh, I can't be tempted down this dark? I don't know. I mean, it just sort of, it's an interesting one of the many interesting little moments that make this sort of like, what's going on here? But it's not spelled out.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I feel like it's just him responding to her response to the violence. I feel like Túrin himself is not a bloodthirsty character. He's more like the old warrior code sort of thing, like I will kill for glory, but not just because it's, not for vengeance or whatever. Yeah. Although I feel like he does that occasionally.
Or if his honor has been questioned somehow, like with Saros,
yeah.
But he's not, when she's like, oh yeah, what you could do is kill this guy and then you get rewarded. That's not what he's about. He's not in it for that.
Yeah, he has stopped the crime.
Yeah.
And it's talked about a little earlier at that point in the story about how, he's caught up. Interestingly, the story doesn't say exactly what they do, but he says he participates in their outlawry and deeds that he doesn't like it. He doesn't say what exactly that is, though. Does he end up helping kill people? Does he end up just simply stealing? What is it? It doesn't say. You can read things into that, but again, it's one of those things that, who knows? It's a very interesting little detail.
Although I feel like when Beleg finds him, he repents of killing men or something. I swear to God, that was
something like that. Yeah, and it could be just because of Forwig's death, but it also, who knows?
I'm gonna guess there were other bodies in there.
Yeah, no, for sure.
Mm-hmm. And of course, this also leads up to essentially the founding of Túrin's his first little kingdom. I can't remember the name, the land of Bow and Helm, where it's sort of like, hey, we're gonna fight back against Morgoth. Well, that just gets Morgoth's attention, doesn't it? Mm-hmm. And it's this sort of like it's this thing where Túrin wants to, you could argue he wants to make a mark, but ultimately he really is this. If arguably this is a justice drive, it's like we're being crushed by this thing. We must fight back. But every time he builds up to the point where they can start effectively doing that as a sort of military force, Morgoth just ups the ante and is like, you're going down.
No, here's a dragon.
Yeah. It feels like Túrin is attempting to recreate his father's war and win it.
Mm-hmm.
But
that's a very good way of putting it.
And that's why he keeps, even though it's clearly insane when he's in Nargothrond or whatever, he's like, no, we gotta do a war, guys. And they're like, oh, I guess honor's important. Are we really skulking? Okay, let's do that. And then it goes poorly. And it's like he's not recognizing the pattern.
I mean, I think you could argue that for him, he's sort of like, he's trying to, he realizes at points is like, I've got a greater weapon beyond myself. I've got people. I have charisma and people respond to me, and I'm going to use this so that way we can actually get something better for ourselves. And, that is on the one hand a good impulse, and on the other hand, it is a terrible impulse because it almost begs the question of if he ever learns, which Arguably he doesn't, but he maybe does so in very stumbling and halting ways. Like, the way to think about it is, initially he tries it with the Land of Bow and Helm. What happens? Their sanctuary is sacked. Most of them are dead. He ends up killing Beleg, etc. But he finds himself in Nargothrond thanks to Gwyndor. Now he's like there, and he has gets a sense of things, and he appeals clearly to the sense of, okay, instead of setting put, some part of us really wants to go out and do this shit. I'm not alone, right? And that's the thing. Every time people are agreeing with him, they appeals to an impulse like, yeah, let's do this. What the hell? We keep getting stomped on. Why don't we respond? And he's doing it, especially in the case of Nargothrond. They've already lost their founder and king. Ordreth is the backup. That happened in the story of Beren and Luthien, R.I.P. Finrod, the best of them all. but that sort of thing, that I think is another example of Tolkien's sense of, dare I say, a certain realism. Dare I say a certain sense of, it's sort of like, what is the best thing to do when you're faced by superior forces, and when you're thinking about things? Do you try and hide and write it out, or do you try and fight back? And if you fight back, what do you do? And are you prepared to deal with the possible consequences? That's heavy in its own way, and all that. I'm not saying this is the only way to look at it, but this is not unknown.
No.
With Ordreth, I feel like specifically him, he has this pattern of being like, oh, thank God somebody else is here who can handle this. He's this, like you said, he's the spare. He never was gonna be king, and now he is, and he's like, can somebody else handle this, please? He doesn't say it, but there's this almost sense of relief, I feel like, in the narrative when Túrin shows up and is like, yeah, let's do stuff, and Ordreth's going, okay, so somebody finally is handling just the war.
Mm-hmm. An episode that I think is really well done is essentially the interim one in between Nargothrond and Brethil, where everything finally wraps up, and that's the return home, where he finds he can't go home again because it's sort of like primal vengeance, the people who drove out, who killed and drove out his people, who took over, who took what was meant to be his lordship, all that sort of stuff. I find the scene where he sort of like, comes in, skulking to Brada's home, the Easterling who's taken over there, and he's just sort of speaking with others, and he says, hey, what's going on here? And they're like, why are you speaking the serf tongue around here? Don't do that. That's a very, very deft way of how literally language and power works, in a very, very simple, very direct way. I mean, that's just a good observation right there. But it builds up to the fact that Túrin does reveal himself. He kills Brada. There's an immediate revolt. Things like that. But basically, everyone tells him, essentially, that felt good. We're all going to die. Thanks. We are all going down. And then when they all flee, and he looks back and he sees, hey, the house is burning. It's like Aaron did it. Well, why did she do it? Because she knows she's dead. It's sort of like, it's again this sense of, it's a very interestingly consistent argument. Yes, doing this sort of action is fulfilling in the moment, and it's going to just make things worse. And that is arguably a theme throughout the entire story, which is a hard thing to bear. But at the same time, it's not unrealistic. Once again, it's one of those things that, if you look at things through happier stories, it's like we know, and, if we read the story again, but as part of his Tolkien's old cycles, he basically set up these stories that there will be only temporary triumphs. The only relief is at the very end. The only relief. All the curse of Mandos plays itself out. Everything goes. Every haven, every lord, almost everybody, there's like, family turns against family. There's blood everywhere, all the things. And Morgoth reigns supreme. At the end of it, before the Valar come back, there is like a mere speck of, active resistance. Everyone else is either dead, in hiding, terror, or enslaved. That's, what it comes down to. And arguing for that is a hard thing because, again, we want our heroes to win, and they don't. They don't. How do you make that engagement? And that can be arguably maybe a whole, I don't say a problem with the Book of Lost Tales, but that's a pretty hard thing to have to do, to do that. It's like a mix of stories that were up and down would be one thing, but this is not. It just piles on. And that, I think, leads to just talking about the end of the story, where everything just finally just wraps itself up into a big ball, and everything is just like, is just the thing there. And what I think is interesting is, let's talk about, you could say, Tolkien's or Túrin's most, his two most notable heterosexual relationships, both fail. And in both cases, there's also a third party. Here's the third wheel. We have Gwyndor, who essentially forgives him, saying, like, thanks, you killed him. That's great. Go rescue Gwyndor. It's like, oh, thank you, I think. And all that. He gives Túrin a pass. And then, of course, he ends up in Brethil. He, again, takes over a previously existing kingdom from its lord, essentially. Although it's interesting how Brandir is definitely not Orodreth. He clearly is not pleased with this.
Yeah.
And it just sort of like, we're doing this wrong, and you're not listening to me anymore. Thanks, guys. On the one hand. Nienor shows up. She doesn't know who she is. Things happen there. Brandir loves her. She's attracted to Túrin. Things happen, etc. Things like that. And it's this layering of internal and external disaster tightly wrapped up into a ball that finally just makes everything finally ramps up. It's sort of like everything moves from just simply a series of unfortunate decisions to just a series of just ultimate destruction where there's basically just there's nobody left. And Túrin at that point arguably has finally gained a weird sense of relative wisdom, because when he comes to Brethil, he doesn't immediately turn it into, let's go fight people. It's more like, I'm going to hunker down. He only takes on the sword again to fight after persuasion. He's sort of like, okay, I'll get into it. And he's not really, enthused about it, but he starts doing it. And then that basically attracts Glaurung, and Glaurung's like, oh, goody, that's where you are. I've been waiting for this. Let me come over there. And I should say at this point that Alan Lee's artwork throughout the final version is really remarkable. I really love it. And one of his color illustrations is a distant shot of basically Glaurung in the distance coming across, burning the fields as he goes, heading towards the very one. Oriana's holding it up. And I just like that because, again, it's not the moment of great confrontation. It's more like, this is the threat. And if you were in that position somewhere on a hillside or something, seeing that coming, you're probably like, you just feel, you literally feel the burn.
It's such a great illustration. It's my favorite in the book. Is that
it's really remarkable. Alan Lee does a really, really good job. I think he's probably the most successful visualizer of Beleriand for me, especially Beleriand in this phase where it's no longer like this happy realm. Everything is like pretty damn sad. It's going south. It's going south hard. But the thing about that, that final dramatic confrontation where, we have, it's marvelously epic. Túrin does do a marvelously epic, heroic deed, the killing of Glaurung. It is, it's wonderfully well set up. We have, last minute cowardice on the part of one of his companions, assistance on another's, and Neil's death. But this like moment where Túrin, dare I say, it's a classic moment, right where it needs to be. He's there with a sword. He hits things. It's massive destruction. It's great, and then it rapidly becomes ungreat. And and then first he tries to withdraw the sword. Glaurung paralyzes almost his last actions. He swoons. Nienor comes, binds his wounds. With his very, very last action, Glaurung reveals the truth to Nienor. Finally understands what the hell's going on, and that moment's pretty harrowing when she just is sort of like it's sort of like, oh my god, and it's Tolkien. I have to say, Tolkien's not salacious about this prospect of incest. This is not very George R. R. Martin, dare I say. It's incredibly flat and matter of fact. And I think that, and part of that is the thing everyone else, you as the reader go like, oh yeah. But everyone else is just sort of like, because they don't know.
Yeah,
Nobody knows.
I think that's why it works so well.
Yeah.
It's good dramatic irony.
It really is. And she kills herself. She, throws that, Brandir, runs away basically back to his people, just telling him, it's good this all happened. This destructive force is over. And that gets to what I find to be, and this is what hit me most in reading this. And maybe this is where I'll end. There's a lot more to say about this book, but we have talked quite a bit, is that the most harrowing moment of the book I found, and it's the most cathartic, sympathetic moment, I think. And Túrin to this point, has done a lot of horrible stuff. And, and interestingly, we're also talking about somebody who, for him, there's almost like no God. And I think that's important. It's very interesting. There's really no concept of sin or anything here. All he really knows is there's a Valar here, and he's Morgoth, and he's tormenting us. We've got these elves that tell us there's something better, and that's nice. But we don't see him like railing against Eru or arguing theological points or things like that, which is kind of part and parcel with Tolkien. That doesn't really happen except in various side things. These characters are just simply like, I'm alive, and this is what I'm dealing with. The end, and I guess there's fates outside the worlds, whatever, and all that, it just goes from there. It's that moment where he wakes up and he says, "Oh, geez, well, Glaurung's dead. Someone found my hand. Oh, but damn, we did it. This is great. And I'm going to go back and Brandir can help fix things up for me. And I can't wait to see Nienor again. And we've done this great deed." And you're sort of like, "Oh my God, you poor bastard. You don't know." And it's just like, it's this horrible feeling where everyone else knows from reading the story that this is not going to last. But he has this one moment where it seems like finally everything is where it should be. In his knowledge, his sister and his mother are in Doriath. He has destroyed Glaurung, who destroyed Nargothrond. He has completed this vengeance against this thing that, avenging Finduilas, Gwyndor, and this entire kingdom they led to destruction. Just sort of like he has killed one of Morgoth's, ultimate servants. It's something amazing here. And it all goes to hell so quickly. And again, it's that moment where he thinks he's found peace. And the terrible thing is this. Even if Glaurung hadn't told, Nienor, you read the story, you almost wish, don't think so, but it doesn't happen. Even if Glaurung hadn't told Nienor, let's say the story had been, let's say this was real life and another path had happened. And it's sort of like he came back and Nienor was waiting for him and Brandir was helping him, all the rest of it. Mablung's still on his way. Mm-hmm. And as soon as Mablung gets there and says like, "Hey, your sister. Your brother and sister, right?" And it will all go to hell that way too.
Yeah.
And so the Deus Ex Machina in reverse of Mablung showing up and being the final, "Hey, it's like this," which is, again, just sort of like what happens in Oedipus, essentially. The right person's there at the right time saying, "No, this is what happened. This is the story. This is the truth of it." It's very much that sense of it. So on the one hand, it's sort of like, "Oh, how well timed." But on the other hand, this is a model. And, it's sort of like, it almost had to happen that way one way or another. It's sort of like, he has that brief moment of peace. No matter what happens, though, it's going to go to hell one way or another. It goes to hell in the way we saw in the story. And that I think really sticks with me. It's sort of like, wow. And maybe related to that final point, Túrin to me is kind of the anti-Aragorn, which sounds strange.
No, that tracks.
But yeah, it's sort of like, two darkly charismatic figures. One has figured out life and the other one hasn't. And that's blunt and that's reductive.
I think, though, it works, too, because Aragorn grows up in a period of relative peace. He gets to go, and it is fascinating to me that, is it Elrond in the Council of Elrond who is like, "Frodo, man, I'm going to name you among the elf, the chiefest of the elf friends, Beren and Túrin," and I'm like, hold on a second. This guy is the reason that Nargothrond fell. This guy, thought that he was kind of king shit in Doriath for a while.
Mm-hmm.
He never fully appreciates, but it feels as though then this goes back to the sort of arrogance, or confidence in his place in the world, I suppose, where, he's brought to Thingol's foster son, a thing that should not happen at all.
Mm-hmm.
And yet Thingol's like, "Here, I'm going to put you on my knee." And he just never fully realizes how incredible an opportunity this is. And what a gift it is that these people have taken him in.
So entitled.
It is, right? He's like, "Oh my God, I can't believe these people are hassling me. Like, Melian, don't tell me to stay here. What are you? Come on." It's like, she knows what she's talking about, man.
But that, I think, makes him more it doesn't make him a better person. No. You clearly don't want to be him, but it's one of those things you see. It's like, oh yeah, I understand that. Or you've seen people like that.
He's very fully realized.
All too. So, well, were there any last thoughts about the book? Or
I've got a couple actually.
Yeah, go right ahead.
To talk, I guess, briefly, because I don't know how much there's to actually say about it. But this one of the things that makes this almost not anti-Tolkien, but like dark Tolkien, is the way the selfless characters are consistently not rewarded for their selflessness. Lady Arryn, who helps Morwen when her husband's away at the risk of her own. She gets beaten up by her husband for doing it, but she still helps Morwen, and then burns herself alive in the hall after the final confrontation with Túrin because there's nothing else left for her. Gwyndor helps him back to Nargothrond, and then I forget, Gwyndor dies, right?
Yeah,
he dies in the Battle of Tomalod.
Túrin steals his girl without meaning to. all these horrible things happen to the people who are just trying to do what's right for everybody around them. I think Brandir kind of counts too.
Absolutely.
Oh, yeah.
He just gets straight up murdered at the end.
Yeah.
You know, you read Lord of the Rings, and like Sam is like the best person ever because he's so selfless. He loves Mr. Frodo and all that. And Aragorn like puts off his claim to the throne as long as possible so he can do whatever. And they mount this hopeless attack against Sauron to distract from the ring. There's, selflessness saves the day after a certain point. And in this book, it just makes things worse all the time, which is certainly a choice for Tolkien to do. I mean, I wouldn't have expected that from him, I guess.
I think that really puts the lie to people who are like, Tolkien's just like a morality play.
It's just like good versus evil.
No.
Yeah, like if all you know is Lord of the Rings, even Lord of the Rings is more complicated than that. So like, And the other thing that I wanted to bring up, this is maybe more of a me thing, was the number of differences between the book, The Children of Húrin, and the published Silmarillion. There's so much. Obviously, there's more detail, but like the thing with Lady Arryn who burns herself in the hall and all that. That's not really in the Silmarillion. She gets like a paragraph, and it was like that felt like a slap in the face reading. She dies. What the hell? Or I mean, you guys got to read this book if you haven't. Like little things, like at one point, I think Túrin brings up Baron in front of Thingol, and Melian's like, you don't want to do that.
Keep his name out of your mouth.
Like you don't want to talk about that in front of the father of Luthien. It's so juicy.
Yeah.
I mean, I googled this out of curiosity today to see if there were any reviews that I felt like reading, and one of them was like, oh, it doesn't give you much more than you get in the Silmarillion. And I got so mad because like you get the plot. The plot's the same in the Silmarillion, but you miss out on all of this texture. Even like something like the Petty-dwarves, we didn't really get into, but they're like the lowest of the low in Middle Earth, and the elves used to hunt them for sport without realizing they were people. And that's such a friggin' dark detail.
Wild.
Oh yeah.
So yeah, just read it. It's depressing, but you'll.
Also, this is unrelated, and we probably don't have time for this, but the stuff in Mim's sack that it's like
there's potatoes,
it's potatoes, right?
Yeah,
Okay.
potatoes, yeah. It's kind of, this one was my thought.
Yeah, he's like, we call it earth bread, but we're not going to tell you where we get it.
It's like
and
South America.
Okay. But it's basically potatoes. It's a sack of roots.
Very funny to me that like no one else in Middle Earth had discovered root vegetables. Like.
Not at this point. Yavanna only knew so much. I don't know.
Very funny to me.
She only passed. It's the Noldor in Middle Earth at this point. They're not super interested in that kind of thing.
Well,
yeah. No, they're not about
you would
plants.
think that they were, interested in the ground. They'd have. I guess you can't craft them into things.
Yeah, they're like,
They were probably like, what is this stuff in the way of us digging for gold? Well, all right, never mind. Meanwhile, Petty-dwarves are like, hey, wait.
That's my breakfast.
Yeah. So, but I mean, as Jared and Oriana have said, there is, the details and the extra development of so much in this story. Again, it makes you regret that Tolkien did not, do the same throughout with everything else. It would have been fascinating to see what a revised, a complete Fall of Gondolin would have been like if he had completed it around the same time with the same impulse. If he had developed it, even to a state equivalent to this, not necessarily complete, but much more detailed than what we got. Maybe Tor would be a little less, just a guy. I don't know, but we could probably have more about Maeglin, more about Turgon's essential pride that resulted in the destruction of. There's a lot of stuff you can sense as sort of like what that level of detail might have gone into, even though the stories themselves, Tor and Túrin have much different fates, of course, and that's a factor too. And so, I think that maybe to end on. Heroic stories appeal, but tragic stories appeal. I keep mentioning Greek tragedy. The other comparison point here, especially in the last revelations that make it all clear what the hell is going on, is of course Oedipus. If you want to combine that in with incest and things like this, and that is a case where somebody is a good person and they have done what they believe are good, proper things. You have no idea, that was done out of ignorance, and again, it's Tolkien. The way Tolkien phrases it, I mean, I always felt a chill when I first read the line, and I still do reading it again, just because the way that Glaurung dies when he tells Nienor, the worst of his deeds you will feel in yourself. And I'm like, that is fucking visceral and deep. That is
She's pregnant at the time, if that wasn't clear from before. Like,
yeah, and that's sort of like, yeah, wow, good job, dude. You knew how to write this character. That's for sure. That is, Glaurung is petty, but that is the pettiness that isn't even petty. That's just you're. That just it's almost beyond words. And yeah, so a remarkable story. Read it if you haven't. I will say, just as a quick note, that by all means check out the other two books that Christopher Tolkien put together towards the end of his life, The Fall of Gondolin and Baron Luthien, with the knowledge that those are not read through fully polished up stories. That is more a collection of the overlays and versions, whereas the Children of Húrin, you can, and he intentionally said so, read it straight through and then read the appendices at the end explaining how he created this version of it. You can tell part of it was Christopher Tolkien's apologia. Okay, look, the Silmarillion was this. Here's what I did this time. He's making that clear, but it is really worth it, and I'm not surprised that it's sort of taken on a very sort of increasingly totemic position among, again, younger fans too, because it's sort of like, hey, this is here too. This is part of the story. Whereas, older fans, to a degree, were sort of like, oh, we came to this a little later or not as much, and so it does fill that function. We'll see where it goes. And if this is ever adapted, oh boy, but as far as we know, it hasn't happened yet or won't be. So we'll wrap up there. Okay, so it's time to look ahead to the next episode, and that is Oriana's choice of topic. Oriana, what are we going to talk about next time?
The Eagles are coming.
Yes. We had to do it. We had to do it.
The Eagles in general. There's a lot of eagles in a lot of stories that take place in Middle Earth. So I want to talk about them as what are they for our listeners who may not be sort of steeped in the lore, but also their function in the story, because they have a function in all of the stories, and it's not just plot device, plot hole nonsense. So we'll talk about that. A nice like something a little later, I suppose.
Almost anything would be after that.
That's true. That's true.
Dear me. Okay. Well, that'll be what we'll do next time. So you'll hear from us on that early August or so. This episode should be coming out here a little after the 4th of July. So happy holiday or something. So, but anyway, thank you as always very much for listening. We'll see if we have more news next time on the Amazon series. My guess is no, but we'll find out. And cross fingers we hear a little something more down the way. But we will have the Eagles for you next time. Looking forward to that. So until we speak to you all again, thanks very much for listening. Talk to you next time. Thanks again for listening to this episode of By-The-Bywater. Please subscribe and rate us via your favorite podcast listening options.
Episodes and show notes are at megaphonic.fm/By-The-Bywater, all one word. You can also message us through here. Email us at bythebywater@megaphonic.fm, or follow us on Twitter at By-The-Bywater.
You can also follow us individually on Twitter and ask questions there. I'm at Vandroid Helsing.
I'm at Schwinter, SCHWINDTER.
And I'm Ned Raggett, 2 G's, 2 T's. By-The-Bywater is a proud member of Megaphonic Podcast Network. Find all our fancy little shows at megaphonic.fm. We hope you join us again next time. Until then, Namarie.